Minä olen Sarah. Tämä on Overkill Global, BangerTV's kansainvälinen heavy metali ja Elma. Hey, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to Overkill Global. You can probably tell from my next global video, I'm heading back to my country of dual citizenship, which is Finland. It's a country of around 6 million people, and their history begins around 9000 BC, but the nation didn't actually gain independence until 1917 after centuries of territorial disputes between Sweden and Russia. And for some really deep context into the legendary Finnish concept of sisu, I'd recommend reading into their hard-earned independence, as well as about the Russo-Finnish Winter War, which was a brutal subarctic winter campaign that saw Finland crushed by the weight of the Russian army at the onset of World War II. They fought a shockingly successful guerrilla campaign on skis. So on that note, read Frozen Hell because it is riveting. And that's all about the grimness of Finland and the coldness. But what everyone sees about Finland is actually quite different. For the 4th year running, it's been rated the happiest country in the world because, to the shock of no one, it turns out that having an extremely strong social safety net and universal healthcare and free schooling makes citizens happy and extremely productive. Evidently, it also means that they make a ton of satanic, psychosexual, killer heavy metal to rebel against their deeply Christian roots and to celebrate the extremely dark, incestuous, suicide-heavy Finnish epic, the Kalevala. This is a graphic novel version of that story. It is amazing. All that history and information aside, on that note, we are going to be jumping in. We're going to have an expert talk about the Finnish death metal scene. I'm going to present my own personal top 5 picks, and then we'll go into further listening suggestions. Let's dive in. Okay, so to learn more about the Finnish death metal scene, let's hear from the authors of Rotting Ways to Misery, The History of Finnish Death Metal. It's a newly translated English language book about the history of Finnish death metal, by Markus, Makkonen, and Kim Strömsholm.
Hello, my name is Markus, and I was asked to speak a little about my favorite releases from the Finnish scene. I would like to choose From the Shadows, the first album of Unholy. Unholy were maybe a bit overlooked, but absolutely essential Finnish death metal band from the early days. They played Death Doom before there was Death Doom around, and they had strong leanings towards occult, really avant-gardist songwriting, great vocals, calling them the Celtic Frost of the Finnish scene is absolutely correct. I would like to choose Vacant Coffin, only album, Sewer Sculpture. This was Pekka and Lasse from Hooded Menace before they got Hooded Menace going. You can hear already the Lasse's distinctive way of writing music, the harmonies, the riffs, but also it's more carcass oriented, faster, gnarlier, very moshable. Absolutely killer album, great drumming from Pekka. Everything in this is fantastic. Kim, the other author of the book, who told me to mention, there's a list of our favorite releases here, and he told to mention the Mordicus demo, Abominations of the Earth, which is his favorite from the Finnish early days. Quite carcassy, but very raw, unpolished, effective. And as a full albums go, he chose Nespeth by Demilich. They did an album that is one of a kind still today. This is a must, if you will. Thanks for checking out, and check out the book and keep on supporting death metal.
Now, to set things up, I'm going to continue talking about the death metal scene, mostly chronologically to present day, although with the first release, I'm going to be jumping forward, and with the second release, I'll be moving back. And the reason why I'm doing this is because of demos and how important they are for scene creation. And honestly, we could have featured so many demos. There's so many important demos. Among them are the debut 1989 demo by Paimo outfit Funebre entitled Cranial Torment, which many consider to be the first definitive Finnish death metal release. We could have also talked about the amazing debut demos by Sentence, or Aberrance, or Morphus, or Putrinance. And yes, I know that their debut is an EP, but instead of all that, I decided to feature the almighty Rippikoulu. And the reason why I picked Rippikoulu is because they sing in Finnish, and they were the first band to do so in the death metal scene. They also played a little bit slower and lower, unlike Funebre, who were a bit bouncier sounding, and shout out for that word usage to Gonlick, who made an amazing primer to Finnish death metal. Link to that video is in the video description. But for now, let's listen to some Rippikoulu. This is Kuulmaton Totas. Rippikoulu were very formative in the early days of the Finnish death metal scene, and they incorporated a lot of doom into their sound after initially starting out as more of a punk metal hybrid. But this second demo of theirs really shows a good way to differentiate Finnish death metal from Swedish death metal. In the late 80s and early 90s, Swedish death metal clearly was already an international phenomenon, and Finnish musicians were obviously inspired to start their own strain of death metal with more gloom and misery, which is a very Finnish response to something. In the true Finnish spirit, Finnish musicians zagged instead of zigged, and they did their own thing, and they started to make Finnish death metal its own unique entity. Because this demo is a truly incredible touchstone for Finnish death metal, it's getting 5 skulls out of 5. Okay, so now it is time to talk about the next record in the series, and that release is by a band that formed in 1990 in Nokia. The absolutely mighty Convulse with their 1991 debut, World Without God, by Thrash Records. This is Convulse with Putrid Intercourse. This album is personally another favorite of mine. It's a classic example of less is more. It's no frills, filthy, godless, lo-fi, rumbling, body-obsessed death metal with the best bass tone and hell, the best frequency that you could possibly ask for. It's just headbangingly good, meat and potatoes, frenzied growling, and solos death metal album for showing us that less means more, that the death metal world needs to be headbanging and rumbly and lo-fi and can just be really consistent. World Without God is also getting 5 skulls out of 5. So now we're going to talk about the third album, and this record is from the 2000s, which was a weird era for Finnish death metal, as the scene really slowed down and the majority of albums from the classic bands weren't particularly good. That said, there were some great newcomers who were repping the scene in bands like Stench of Decay and Descended, as well as releases by bands like Keiko Daemon, who we'll discuss in more detail later in this video. But there was a band that was really carrying the torch for Finnish death metal in a consistent, high-quality way, and that is one that Blaine worships. That band, of course, is the one and only Hooded Menace, whose roots in Finnish death metal run very deep indeed. Here is a crushingly heavy moment from their excellent 2008 debut, Fulfill the Curse. Oh, I love this song. And we should talk about Hooded Menace a little more in depth. The band formed in Joensuu in 2007 and features Lasse Pikko, I think, of Phlegethon, a Finnish death thrash band that released multiple demos and splits starting in 1989. Phlegethon functioned throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and they released demos and splits and eventually compilations. Then Lasse moved on to form Hooded Menace. Hooded Menace were definitely part of a very specific style, one that was concurrent with bands like Coffins in Japan, then definitely emulated by American acts like Acid Witch, which Lasse was part of, and Temple of Void, who I reviewed back in 2017.
This band has a lot in common with Coffins and with Hooded Menace.
They are definitely definitely carrying the torch for old school Finnish death metal, and you can tell that they were likely equally inspired by their Finnish cohorts in both Convulse and Thergathon. It's like if you split those two bands down the middle, you'd get something along the lines of Hooded Menace. Maybe I'm just saying that because I really wanted to bring up Thergathon and Stream from the Heavens because it's an early masterpiece of funeral doom, but was then known as just like the slowest death metal possible. And we also still haven't talked about Skepticism, but now I'm just getting ahead of myself because Finnish death metal rules, and I wish I could discuss every single strain, but you may have noticed that I am instead focusing on a very specific part of the Finnish death metal scene, which is a little more doom inclined. So yeah, that brings us to the skull rating. For kicking off the band in a truly vile, filthy, fuzzy, cavernous way, Hooded Menace debut, Fulfill the Curse, gets 4 skulls out of 5. All right, so now we're gonna head into the 2010s and 2020s to get this video tied up neatly in a semi-chronological bow. Yes? Yes. The next band that I'm featuring, I've brought up on Banger a handful of times, and they are incredibly dense and malevolent death metal band who is signed to Dark Descent Records, and their name is Swallowed. They released 2 killer demos and 1 full-length, Lunaterial, in 2014 before breaking up. Let's listen to Swallowed. So it goes without saying, Swallowed is awesome, and I ended up getting pretty obsessed with them shortly after their second demo, which was 2008's Epitaph of Nauseation. It's a particularly dense and really ugly form of death metal that has a lot in common with black metal, which I don't think is particularly unusual in the context of Finnish death metal. I also think that it's important to note that this album came out in 2014, which is around the time that it seemed to feel like worldwide people were starting to acknowledge and celebrate Finnish death metal as its own unique entity. It was during that period that the Finnish Death Metal Maniacs Festival came to fruition as well, with their debut 2015 rendition, which featured a ton of killer bands. So yeah, Swallowed was one of the bands that was helping carry the torch of Finnish death metal into the future, and was signed to an American label, which is Dark Descent, which shows that the genre was like really picking up in notoriety and interest internationally. For just being an album for sick fucking freaks, Lunaterial gets 4.5 skulls out of 5. So that kind of brings us to modern day. Where is Finnish death metal currently? Well, it's obviously still thriving with a handful of promising bands. So for the final album, we are going to shift towards a more present day release, which is also on Dark Descent Records, because Dark Descent Records has pretty much the best taste in underground death metal. The band we'll talk about is Lantern. They formed in 2007 in Kuopio. They released their debut Below in 2013 and the album 2 Morphus in 2017, and then they unleashed Dimensions in 2020. Let's check out the opening track from that album. It is called Strange Nebula. This band is really interesting and goes off on a lot of deliciously strange tangents and just sounds great. And that's no surprise given that guitarist and bassist Cruciatus was also in the acclaimed Finnish death metal band Keiko Daemon, who are one of the only bands really carrying the torch for Finnish death metal throughout the 2000s in an awesome way. Anyway, Keiko Daemon released their debut Full Moon Ritual in 2001, followed by The Demonic Invocation in 2004, and Tales of Demoncy in 2007. Now that Cruciatus is spearheading Lantern, he's finally getting more widely recognized for his obvious talents. For being a great modern example of Finnish death metal that brings the old sound to current day and offers variations on the theme, Lantern's Dimensions is getting 4 skulls out of 5. Okay, so what did we learn? Aside from the fact that whenever I think about Finland, I get happy and then I put flowers in my hair. I know it looks very beautiful. But aside from that, I learned something I already knew, which is that Finnish death metal is a monochromatic sausage fest. It also has an amazing lineage. There are many stylistic tangents and artists and albums that I really wanted to talk about and feature, but I didn't because, you know, we just don't have enough time and space. And I really wanted to provide a list for you all with a little bit more left field choices because there's tons of lists of Finnish death metal on the internet. So nothing more is going to be said about hugely influential bands like Sentenced or Amorphous or the like. So let's go. The shout-outs. You know, I love shout-outs. First up, I wanted to shout out to Demilich. They put out their absolutely classic technical thrash, avant-garde death metal masterwork, Dispenth, in 1993. Had I chosen not to hyper-focus on the more doomy side of death metal, I would have definitely highlighted this album because it's great, and I think it can be summed up in one phrase, which is like demonic toad noises. Yeah, demonic toad noises. Second up, listen to Xysma and their first album, First and Magical from 1993. What a strange fucking band. One that went from proto-grindcore to pop and did everything in between. Listen to their entire discography in order for a complete mindfuck. Next up, Loma-based Finnish death metal band Demigod released their debut, Slumber of Sullen Eyes, in 1992, which in true Finnish style does all sorts of very strange things. You really should just check it out for yourself. Number 4, Cemetery Fog released the absolutely fantastic 2013 debut Shadows from the Cemetery. Personally, absolutely love this one. And although I wasn't a big fan of their follow-up EP Towards the Gates, that's okay. These dudes are now in another band called Acidophilus, and they released their debut full-length album Stygian Dreams in 2019. That is death doom that emulates the Peaceful 3 rather than Finnish death metal. Okay, that's it. I really hope that you found some amazing albums. Go buy some records, go buy some digital files. That's it. That's all. Bye.